In this lecture, we're going to go over cost and benefit and opportunity cost. We're actually going to start with opportunity cost and then move on to cost and benefit. So we're going to start with the story of Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth is perhaps the most famous baseball player of all time. He played 22 MLB seasons from 1914 through 1935. He began his career as a star, a left-handed pitcher for the Boston Red Sox. However, he became most famous when he went over to the New York Yankees. That's what we have pictured here, is Ruth with the Yankees. So beginning in 1915, basically from his first full season in the majors, Ruth was the best pitcher in the major leagues. However, in 1919, still with the Red Sox, Ruth switched to being a position player. This is an extremely unusual thing throughout the history of Major League Baseball. We've seen a few cases of players switching, though maybe more out of necessity than because they were the best at their position. Rick Ankiel of the Cardinals comes to mind, an outfielder that switched to being a pitcher. And we see a few players, such as Shohei Ohtani, who seem to be able to do both. But it's exceedingly rare that we would see a player successfully switch positions. Ruth, however, did exactly this. Turns out that Babe Ruth was also the best hitter in the major leagues at the time. Not only was he the best pitcher, but when he switched to being a hitter, he was the best. This is an idea in economics we call absolute advantage. Absolute advantage is when an economic actor can produce more given the same resources as another actor. So given the same time, given the same components, given the same resources, tools, assets, etc., you compare the output. The economic actor that produces more has what we call the absolute advantage. So if we have a classic example would be like assembly line workers. If you have two workers and they're both given the same tools and the same inputs, and you give them a day's worth of work, and one of them produces 10 widgets and another produces 8, the one that produced 10 widgets has absolute advantage. What we're saying here is Ruth was the best pitcher, absolute advantage in pitching, and the best hitter. He had the absolute advantage as a position player as well. Now, this brings us to an important idea in economics called opportunity cost. Now, while we have seen a few examples of players doing both hitting and pitching to some scale, again, Shohei Ohtani, a prime example of this, although probably the only real example of that in history of Major League Baseball to this point. It's generally the case that we can only do one or the other. Basically, all players in the history of baseball are either a pitcher or they are a hitter. And that leads us to an important idea. You can only, at one time, choose one thing. When we're making a choice, it is by definition, it is rooted in reality, that when we make a choice, we leave other paths untaken. When I chose to go to graduate school to work on my PhD in economics, I forewent the opportunity to go to grad school and work on finance. So I wasn't then going to get a finance PhD, at least not at that time. And that renders what we call an opportunity cost. And your opportunity cost is the value of the best foregone option. Okay. Remember, it's only one option at a time that can be the opportunity cost, because even if we made some other choice, we still can only do one thing. What I decide to have for lunch, if I choose to have Chick-fil-A, I forego McDonald's, I forego a homemade meal, I forego whatever it is that I might have done in the alternative. Okay, so when Ruth switched to being a hitter, his opportunity cost was being a pitcher. Notice, though, that had he chosen to stay as a pitcher, he would have foregone becoming a hitter. So sort of no choice, choosing not to do something, is the same kind of choice as choosing to do something. Let's make this a little concrete. You're choosing to listen to this lecture, and let's assume for the moment you're giving it your full attention, and so you're not able to simultaneously do other things, right? That means you're foregoing doing something else, right? What some of those things might be? Well, you might be able to eat lunch instead of doing this. You might be able to give your mother a call. Or you might be able to take a nap. These are all potential opportunity costs. Now, which one's an opportunity cost? Only the one that we would be doing. So let's say you're listening to this lecture and your tummy's rumbling. You're quite hungry. And so if you weren't listening to this lecture, you would be getting yourself some lunch. That means if you weren't listening to this lecture, you still wouldn't be calling mom. You still wouldn't be taking a nap. So your opportunity cost in this case is lunch. So Ruth faced an opportunity cost here between choosing to be a hitter who then didn't pitch or choosing to be a pitcher who then didn't hit. So let's do some analysis here. I'm showing you a picture of the Red Sox pitching rotation from 1915. So notice that here we see Ruth in the picture, but it's got some of the other Red Sox pitchers. This pitcher is particularly important. This is Dutch Leonard. Dutch Leonard is the pitcher who replaced Babe Ruth in the Red Sox rotation. Okay, so when Ruth switched from being a pitcher, being a pitcher to being a hitter, somebody had to replace him in the rotation, and that was Dutch Leonard. Now, Ruth allowed basically 2 runs per 9 innings. Another way that we'd say that is ERA, earned run average, very common baseball statistic. When Leonard replaced him, he allowed 2.72 runs per 9 innings, his ERA. That means over the course of a season, roughly 30 starts, the net difference there is about 10 runs. So by switching Ruth away from pitching, the Red Sox allowed 10 more runs than they otherwise would have. Of course, Ruth didn't just evaporate. He just went to the other side, became a hitter. So Ruth then produced 105 runs in his first season as a hitter in 1919. So that runs produced figure from Leeds and Van Almen, the textbook, is just runs plus RBIs minus home runs. Why minus home runs? Because, of course, when you hit a home run, you might have multiple RBIs, and you will also have a run. So it just prevents double counting. So we're just saying all your runs and RBIs, except the situations where you knocked yourself in. So for my non-baseball fans, to knock a run in is slang for hitting the ball such that one of your teammates or yourself ends up scoring. That's called a run batted in. So Ruth switching then netted the Red Sox an estimated 20 runs, the difference between these two numbers, and an estimated 20 runs. And so the opportunity cost of Ruth pitching following this formulation would be 20 runs. That's a highlight of how we would calculate opportunity cost. So if you don't switch, you're giving up 20 runs there. Okay. However, we can do a little bit better, and we can do a little bit better because of a field called sabermetrics, sort of the founding father of sabermetrics, if you will, is this man, Bill James. And Bill James said sabermetrics is the search for objective knowledge about baseball. So what is sabermetrics? Sabermetrics is about evaluating the sport of baseball more accurately and more finely, more granularly, right, at lower and lower levels with more detail, with more nuance. So baseball is interesting because it inherently has many statistics involved, more so than any other sport, right? And so what sabermetrics wants to do is how do we value players and player characteristics along with different strategies that we might employ on the field by studying statistics. And there's many applications of that. We're going to look at just a couple here. And the ones we're going to focus on is this idea called runs produced. It's an extremely crude measure, and it has a very obvious flaw, right? If you're a batter in a superior lineup, you will get more RBIs because your teammates will more often knock you in when you're on base, and you will score more runs because of that. And then when you come up to bat, you will more often have players on base for you to get your RBIs by knocking them in. Sabermetric approaches this several different ways. My preferred statistic, though, is what's called weighted runs created. So what we do is we weight each offensive outcome by its league-wide average run value. Okay, that's a little confusing, so let's explain it, right? If you take the relationship between runs scored and all the different potential offensive outcomes. So what's an offensive outcome? This is a single, a double, a triple, a home run, a walk, a hit by pitch, a strikeout, ground into double play. Lots of things I can do when I'm a batter when I terminate my at bat, right? And each of these will help or hurt my team. And on average, we can take all of the data, all of the team's production and runs, and we can calculate on average how many runs does a single contribute to a team. How is that? Well, I can hit a single, and then the next guy behind me can hit into a double play, and it doesn't score a run. I can hit a single, and the next guy behind me can hit a home run and score 2 runs. I can hit a single and knock in a guy from third, and so on. We can calculate the average. So we take each potential outcome and we weight them, and then we just add up the total production that a player had by their offensive production. So each single gives them 0.3 of a run. I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but just say. And let's say each double is 0.7 of a run. So if I have a single and double, that adds up to a run. If I have 2 singles and 2 doubles, I've accounted for 2 runs. So weighted runs created. So a more sophisticated runs produced. I actually played recreational baseball when I was in grad school, and it was a great example of this. And when I was playing, I played on sort of a very poor team, right? And so I would get a hit, but nobody would be on base, or I would take a walk, and then everybody after me would end up striking out. So I didn't score terribly many runs, right? And had I been on a different team, perhaps the players around me would have helped me, right? Not saying my play would have improved or not improved. It's just even the same level of production would matter differently in a different lineup. This is important because valuing offensive production is the very core of sabermetrics. That's kind of the heart of what sabermetrics does, and then it builds on everything. You can think of baseball sort of as trying to score runs when you're on offense and trying to prevent runs. Obviously, this is the nature of any sport, right? And so we begin as a defensive team by thinking about what strategies an offensive team is going to adopt. Now, baseball is a little backwards, right? Because in other sports, the team that starts with the ball is the team that's on offense, right? When we're playing basketball, when we're playing football, the team that has the puck. When we're playing hockey, the team that has the ball. When we're playing soccer, these are the teams that can score. Baseball's unusual because the defense actually starts with the ball in the pitcher's hand, but nonetheless, we typically organize about our strategy around thinking about offensive production. Earned run average, though, is similarly flawed, right? Pitchers with better defenses will allow fewer runs. Again, back to my recreational baseball days. The first day that I pitched, we played against a pretty good team. I was a competent pitcher. Of course, when you play recreational baseball, you do play both ways. You're not like a professional baseball player who can sort of only play pitcher or hitter. You kind of have to do both so that the team has enough pitchers and enough fielders to field a team. And the first play, I got a weak ground ball to probably our best player, who's the third baseman. He fielded it cleanly. He threw to first. Our first baseman, unfortunately, was not our best player and completely whiffed on the ball despite it being a good throw. So no fault of my own as a pitcher. I had a runner on first. Next, I got a pop up to second base. Our second baseman dropped it. Now I had 2 runners on through no fault of my own, right? I had made 2 good pitches. I had got weak contact twice in a row. I struck the next guy out, then promptly got a ground ball to short. It went right through the shortstop's legs. I think they scored a run. I don't remember the exact, but I was in trouble. I then immediately came apart. I hit the next batter, almost gave up a home run on that. I don't even remember how long it took us to get through the inning. The point is, right, I didn't have very good defense behind me, and so I allowed many runs that I might not otherwise have allowed. Of course, at the major league level, these differences are much, much smaller, right? The gap between the best defensive team and the worst defensive team is very small, right? But it's actually important to find a better way to account for a pitcher's performance. And Sabermetrics has an idea. They call this fielding independent pitching, FIP for short. And that takes the things that a pitcher controls, the walks, the strikeouts, and the home runs, uses that to then estimate an ERA. So it's actually sort of similar to regression technique that we take, and then we can estimate, okay, if you give up this many walks, if you get this many strikeouts, if you give up this many home runs, we would estimate your earned run average to be this specific number. So the Sabermetric gives us some better tools than runs produced and earned run average. So I've taken and calculated those for you. Here's a picture of Babe Ruth with the man that that he replaced in the outfield when he became a hitter for the Boston Red Sox. So using better statistics, we can actually get some different estimates. We see that Ruth seemed to have a slightly better defensive club behind him, right? So let's go back to this really quickly. Remember, he had about a 2 ERA and Leonard a 2.7 ERA. When we use FIP instead of ERA, we see that Ruth's earned run average goes up and Leonard's basically doesn't change, meaning Leonard, quite close to being a similarly productive player as Ruth on the mound, only gave up about 6 runs more in the season than Ruth did. Now, if we look the other way, though, we see that the Red Sox needed the hitters. They needed players like Ruth because when he came along, he actually produced 127 runs by weighted runs created, offensive production, and the man that he replaced about 67, leading to a quite large gap of 60 runs. That shows us that we've got about 54 runs on net for the Red Sox by having Ruth switch. So the opportunity cost then of not switching would have been 54 runs. So there's opportunity cost in economics. So we want to turn our attention now to an idea called comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is when an economic actor can produce at a lower opportunity cost, right? Remember, Ruth has the absolute advantage as both hitter and pitcher. Even looking at these statistics, we still see Ruth was the better pitcher. However, Ruth has the comparative advantage as a hitter, but not as a pitcher. Why is that? Because the opportunity cost of Ruth pitching is 60 runs. By pitching, he would deprive the Red Sox of 60 runs. However, his opportunity cost of hitting is only 6 runs, so his opportunity cost is much, much lower. By hitting, he deprived the Red Sox of preventing 6 runs. So we see that the comparative advantage is a different thing than the absolute advantage. It's actually very important in all things trade, and it's a very common idea in economics to say we see two individuals trading, even if you're relatively better, you can produce more, right? We think about international trade. We might think about an example like two nations trading. Perhaps the United States can produce both more oil and more computer chips than Mexico. So we think, oh, well, maybe they shouldn't trade at all. Well, that's an absolute advantage. The United States comparative advantage is going to be in making computer chips. It's much less costly in terms of barrel of oil for us to produce computer chips than it is for us to produce oil in terms of computer chips. Whereas in Mexico, the comparative advantage is the other way around. That facilitates trade in that particular case. Okay, let's turn now to cost-benefit analysis. And to do that, we're going to look at Kyler Murray in the MLB. Kyler Murray played quarterback for the University of Oklahoma in the 2017 and 2018 seasons after transferring from Texas A&M. Murray ended up winning the Heisman Trophy following the 2018 seasons in one of the best college football statistical seasons ever. He also played outfield. That's what this abbreviation is, outfield, for the University of Oklahoma those same 2 seasons. And then, of course, played collegiate summer ball between the two, played for the Harwich Mariners in the Cape Cod League. The Cape Cod League is probably the most famous summer collegiate league in the United States. Murray was a quite talented baseball player in addition to being an excellent quarterback. So good, in fact, that the Oakland Athletics selected Kyler Murray with the 9th pick of the 2018 MLB first-year player draft. That's the draft before the 2018 season, because the MLB draft happens in the summer of 2018, and the A's then allowed Murray to continue to play football in the fall of 2018. Of course, sports fans will know that eventually Kyler Murray went to the 2019 draft and ended up being drafted first overall. But what I want to look at is, how is it that an economic actor might think about things when weighing their decisions? And this is an important idea in economics called decision making under uncertainty. At the time that Murray was going into, or even during his 2018 season with the Sooners, Murray had $4.7 million in hand. He had a signing bonus for $4.7 million and a professional career ahead of him. Now, Murray was playing in a high-profile position at arguably one of the best college football programs, especially at the time, with Lincoln Riley as the head coach in terms of placing quarterbacks in the NFL. But Murray had a choice to make, and one of the ways he might have thought about that is, what position in the draft would he need to be drafted at in order to sort of make his money back? What if it was, we'll go on to some other things that he might be thinking, but just the money estimate. So we know eventually he went at pick 1 and got something like $23 million signing bonus plus a first-year player contract of roughly $7 million a year for 5 years. But there's many different options, right? A player most certainly. Now, Murray again got to make this decision after winning the Heisman, so he knew his chances of going higher were better. But 2 years prior, the Heisman winner Lamar Jackson had gone 32nd, and that would be the breakover point for the same signing bonus. Now, a first-year player contract is more lucrative for an NFL player than for a MLB player because there's more money there. It's not guaranteed, but there's a little bit more money for a first-year player contract if a player sticks with the team. So the breakover point would have basically been being drafted in the first 2 rounds. So we think if Murray's making this decision on finances only, he's making this decision thinking I must at least go in the first 2 rounds. Now, even if he goes in the 3rd or 4th round, 5th round, he's probably still looking at making, substantially less, but still kind of in the ballpark of $4 to $5 million. So one thing that Murray might have contemplated when he's making this decision is, how is it past Heisman winners worked out? And we can see here that a handful of Heisman winners, Eric Crouch, Jason White, Troy Smith, Tim Tebow, Johnny Manziel, were really not successful in the NFL, and likely without being drafted really high, like that first round or higher sort of area, Murray would most likely not continue long enough with the team in order to sort of make that money back. Of course, the trend in recent years, since Sam Bradford got the highest signing bonus ever as a first 1-1 pick, had been, players playing quite long careers. Now, notice what I've got here is quite a few players were active NFL players at the time that Murray made his decision, and this is likely weighed pretty heavily in his decision making, right? Going back to 2009, basically every player that had made the Heisman except Johnny Manziel was still in the league playing. and were most of them having quite excellent careers. And there's reasons for this, right? It's most likely that at the college game was mirroring more closely the NFL game, and Murray was probably taking into account the fact that he's coming from a system that runs uh, an offense that would translate decently well. It's not certainly the Sooners weren't running a professional style offense, but the NFL was beginning to run more options, more pass, more concepts for whatever reason. And actually, we know the reason. The reason is what we call risk aversion. College football tends to see more innovation in play style, especially from offenses, than does the NFL. And the reason for that is, right, the NFL wants tried and true, proven things. And coaches don't want to bring in a new offensive system, fail miserably, and get fired quickly. And so we actually see more experimentation at the college level. There's also just more teams. There's more coaches looking for a competitive edge, right? You're not one of 32, you're one of 123 or so universities. Now, of course, we might see we see quite a few Oklahoma players, and so we might see Murray taking that into account, and it's more likely that he's thinking about what Baker Mayfield and Sam Bradford did in the NFL than Jason White, who ended up not being drafted at the time. So let's go through the pros and cons then that Murray might have been exploring. The first and most obvious thing is a pro for going to the MLB is just lower injury risk, right? Baseball players rarely face the possibility of life-altering injury, while NFL players, that's a daily concern, right? So one prominent case of this is Tua Tagovailoa, right, who has had several concussions, and whose career sort of then was altered forever because of those injuries. And there we can think of many high-profile examples in different positions, but of course, being a quarterback, maybe you're somewhat less concerned about these kind of things. Another pro might be the season length, right? If you love playing baseball and you love playing football and you get to play 162 games, playing baseball as an outfielder, perhaps season length is important. Of course, that might flip the other way. You might get burnt out. MLB seasons are long grind. Not that the NFL seasons aren't, but it's certainly a very different kind of thing. It's probably likely to have a longer career in the MLB, right? Baseball players can play for close to 20 years, which is almost impossible in football, though if you're going to do it, it's definitely going to be at quarterback or perhaps a kicking position. Or we see some players like Peyton Manning and Tom Brady with extraordinarily long careers. In general, your health is probably likely to be better playing baseball than it is playing football, right? The types of injuries you're going to get playing baseball are more like shoulder and elbow injuries. The types of injuries you're more likely to get in football are lower extremities, things like knees or your back, or of course head injuries are the big one. A big pro might be the money in MLB, and that is if you have a contract, you have guaranteed money. So in the NFL, if you're cut, there's only a proportion of your salary that is guaranteed, whereas all of your contract is guaranteed with the MLB. It's also a big earning upside. So the very top players in the MLB tend to earn as much or more than NFL, and there's more of those contracts. And the reason for that is salaries are a fixed cost, and fixed costs being spread over more output makes it more affordable for a team. And because there are 162 games, then MLB teams can tend to pay a little bit more in salary than can NFL teams. Of course, there is just the likelihood of making the majors, right? Of 37 ninth draft picks between 1979 and 2015. 29 of them ended up reaching the majors, which is a pretty high conversion rate. And of course, it's a little difficult to think about that because in NFL, if you're drafted, you're basically gonna go on the team, and then you'll have a short number of years to sort of stick or not stick. Now, there's some big downsides potentially going to MLB. First is you're going to have to go through the minor leagues. Even as a collegiate player, you'll spend at least 2 or 3 years, and some people play quite a bit more. And that's not pleasant, right? You're playing in front of small or non-existent fan bases. You're having to ride buses and live a very impoverished life. Although I guess if you have a big signing bonus, that will help with that a lot. But minor league life is just generally not very pleasant. You're doing a lot of traveling in uncomfortable conditions, and you're not making very much money, and you're ending up sharing rooms with other players, etc. Now, MLB certainly has its share of stars, but it pales in comparison to NFL star power. So if you care about being a famous celebrity, you definitely would prefer the NFL over the MLB. Similarly, you're going to get more publicity as an NFL quarterback than you are as an MLB player. Exhibit A might have been like Mike Trout at his highest, right? He was an enormous superstar and was relatively less famous than a whole host of NBA and NFL stars. Again, we've talked a little bit about burnout and travel. Of course, the travel applies even to the major leagues. And as a previous student of mine had pointed out, there's also intensity of play, right? You might love baseball and football similarly, but you might enjoy a game where you're playing, half the plays, you're getting to touch the ball as the quarterback, as opposed to an outfielder where you might have 3 to 6 outfield chances and 3 to 6 at bats in any given. Now, another thing, of course, as a con is the potentially short career where you don't make it to the majors despite spending time in the minor leagues. So let's look now at the pros and cons of the NFL. As the very best player, the money in the NFL is comparable to the very best players in MLB. There's just more of those big contracts in the MLB. Of course, quarterbacks have the longest careers. And to be honest, probably the most important thing is just simply that Murray liked football better than baseball. And I think that's a very important thing that probably doesn't get talked about enough. Now, other considerations might be just again, I've talked about the star power, but it comes with a certain lifestyle, and you might prefer the NFL lifestyle to the MLB lifestyle. Different off seasons, different schedule of life, different ability to sort of be in different social circles, and it's hard to know from the outside what those might be. Of course, again, you have both extreme short-term and long-term injury risk. Your career probably likely to be shorter. It's going to be harder to stick around in the minor leagues. So if you're a real baseball junkie, you might even be okay with being in the minor leagues because you're still playing professional baseball. Whereas if you're not going to make it in the NFL, you're not going to make it very, very quickly. And then, of course, the non-guaranteed money. So you'll get that signing bonus, which, as we know, is probably in the ballpark of $23 million, which is quite a bit better than the 4.7 that he got from the Oakland Athletics in the MLB first-year player draft. But that might be all he'd have ended up with there. So assuming 2 long careers, you'd expect the earnings to be higher in the MLB. Let's turn now to sort of a broad version of that question and just ask, who should sign a professional baseball contract? How do we think about the cost and benefits for different players? There's actually a paper in the Journal of Sports Economics by Pfeiffer et al. That asks this exact question. So each summer, about 1,200 players are selected in the first-year player draft. And once you're selected as a player, you have 3 options. You can sign that deal. You can not sign and stay in school. So there's 2 different ways for this to happen, right? One is you're a high school player who gets drafted. You forgo signing. You go and play college baseball. Or if you're a junior and you go in the draft in college, then you can come back for your senior year. Of course, if you're a senior, then you're out of options. You either sign the contract or you end up not playing professional baseball that way. You can go to different leagues, pro-am type leagues, or overseas. Japan, Korea have good baseball leagues as well. So you have other options. And then, of course, you can, if you don't stay in school and you go outside of that, you just go into the job market and do what you might otherwise do if your baseball career didn't work out. Now, the dream is making the majors, right? And so the players are doing that not in order to play minor league baseball, but they're doing that in order to make Major League Baseball. Now, of course, the real dream is a second contract, because average major league pay is $4 to $5 million a year. But that's, of course, skewed. That's an average, right? That's skewed by some very large contracts that are making 30 plus million a year, and many players that are on their second or subsequent contracts, and those players make quite a lot of money. If you're on your first year player contract, most of these players are going to be making the major league minimum, which is still good pay, $500,000-$600,000 a year. Now, some players who will be in the second half of their first year player contract, that's a 6-year contract, go into what's called arbitration. So if you're a superstar player, you will make a lot of money even in those arbitration years, but it won't be like what it would be if you were a free agent, right? Because you can't play the different teams against each other, right? So making it to a second and subsequent contract is really how you make a lot of money playing Major League Baseball. Of course, most drafted players don't make the majors at all, and minor league players make almost nothing. They make about $8,000 a season. Now they work minor leagues typically in late August, early September, right? So you're going to work from mid-February to August, and then, of course, lots of minor leaguers that don't have huge signing bonuses are going to go and find off-season jobs, but you're just not making practically any money as a minor league player. Now, this has actually been made worse by the Save America's Pastime Act, which came along and made minor league players exempt from minimum wage laws, and they did that because they're ruled to be seasonal workers, which obviously has some reason to it. But of course, I think there are arguments to be made sort of on both sides here. If you think minimum wage is important, it's not obvious that seasonal workers is really a good exemption from that. But of course, these players are not playing so that they can make money in the minor leagues, so they're probably not harmed terribly much by them being exempt from minor league pay. And we've actually have seen in recent years some MLB teams make a move towards paying their players more, and so I think a natural competition in the sport is likely to probably make that an irrelevant point in the coming years. Now, as economists, we think about this as a human capital issue, right? So in econ, we use the word capital to mean tools that are used to make other things, right? So if we were taking a finance class, capital is money that's used to invest into a business to start that business. In economics, we mean capital are the tools of production, right? So if I'm a construction company, my capital are trucks and heavy equipment, shovels, etc., right? So I'm whatever it is I'm building, if I'm building houses or I'm building roads or whatever, right? Not the variable inputs, not the dirt, not the asphalt, not the 2x4s, right? I'm talking about the tools of construction, right? Like I said, hammers, trucks, etc., right? So we can apply the same kind of idea to mental or physical skills, right? And so we call that human capital. Now, what baseball players are doing is they're foregoing income in the short run for an opportunity later based on increased human capital. This is actually similar in a way to a university education. By going to get a university education, you're probably foregoing, you have an opportunity cost of whatever money you would make when you wouldn't have been going to school, whether that's more hours, whether it's a different career path, whatever it is that you're foregoing, you're probably making less during your college years. And you're doing that in exchange for increasing your human capital and hopefully getting a higher rate, higher income, higher returns to your human capital down the road. Now, in a university setting, right, college graduates make on average 70% more than non-college graduates, so it's not nearly as risky, but you're talking about a similar path. It's just that for baseball players, it's a much higher gain, but much higher risk situation. Now, the problem, of course, is that players tend to overestimate their chances of making the pros. So what did Pfeiffer et al. Do? They went and tried to estimate the break-even points. Where are you drafted? And how does that relate to how long you'll make it in the pros and how much money you'll make in that situation? Okay, and this is what they found. For fielders, if you're a college graduate and you're drafted in the 3rd round or higher before the 90th pick, you're better off. If you're drafted after the 90th pick, you would make more money by foregoing baseball and going on to other careers, right? Whatever job you would do if you weren't in baseball. Okay. For non-grads, that's the 205th pick. And for high school players, that's about the 118th pick. Okay. So the impressive part of this study is that it accounts for many different paths, right? It accounts for what's the probability of you don't make it at all. What's the probability of if you have a successful career. Now, one of the downsides of this paper is that it only covers the first 6 years, so it doesn't account for players who make it really big. And I think that's an extraordinary weakness of this particular study because it's not accounting for what the players are really trying to do, right? Players are really trying to be Bryce Harper and make it to a second contract and make $330 million. They're not trying to have a productive 6 years where they make $10 million, although I'm sure they're not unhappy about that. But baseball players are trying to make it to the major leagues to earn that sort of life-altering type of money. For pitchers, the numbers are a little bit more bleak, right? So you actually have to be drafted almost in the 1st round if you're a college pitcher, a college graduate. If you're a college pitcher who's not a graduate, you need to go in the 172nd pick, and if you're a high school player, sort of in that mid-3rd round or earlier kind of range. Now, there's several problems with this, but I think it's still instructive as just how we might think about this problem. Remember, we're talking about cost-benefit. So this paper is good because it helps us think about what are my odds of making it, what is the money that I am likely to make, how does, right, the higher you're drafted, the more thought of you are as a player by the teams, and the teams kind of know what they're doing. But it has several shortcomings. The first, as I mentioned before, is that it doesn't account for a second contract. Another is it doesn't account for the signing bonus, which is probably a substantial shortfall, especially given that information actually exists, because there's what's called slot money. So each draft pick in the MLB draft has an associated signing bonus with it. Now, do the players get exactly that signing bonus? No, they don't, but it would be the expectation that they would get something like that number, right? And so you can actually get drafted quite a bit lower than, say, the 90th pick if you're getting some signing bonus in addition to your. Now, a college graduate will typically get about a $10,000 signing bonus. Okay, so maybe that's not moving this number very much. But a non-grad and a high school player will get quite a bit bigger signing bonuses, right? Because a college graduate is out of options in terms of going back to school and trying again in the draft, right? And so because their opportunity cost is different, right? The opportunity cost of not signing the contract is very, very high because it means you won't play baseball. You won't play professional baseball. Whereas the opportunity cost for a non-grad, a junior in college, or a high school player is not nearly as high not to sign the contract because you can go back to school and you can try again in 2 years, right? A high schooler is going to get some of the highest signing bonuses because they can go back to college, come out as a junior. If they don't like it then, they can go back and come out as a senior. Now, juniors, the gap isn't as big as you think it would be, right? Because college juniors that are coming out of the draft are more of a sure thing than our high school players. So there's more risk on behalf of the MLB team because they know less about the player when they're coming out of high school. Okay. There's also a big difference between graduates and non-graduates here. So I think an error in the paper, right, is that they treat the non-grad and the college grad as the same in terms of what their likely outcomes are as MLB players, right? But college seniors are going to be less likely to go on to have a good, successful major league career than our college juniors, because the juniors are coming out. They have to be enticed into coming out. Those tend to be better players and have better careers. Similarly, this is a study done on average, and it's the only thing the researchers can do, so there's not really necessarily a mistake there. But players know what their likely outcomes are, right? If I'm a college junior who's doing well in my classes and I'm going to Vanderbilt, then I know if I don't end up playing professional baseball, I have a very high value degree and I'm very likely to finish. If I'm a college junior who's flunking all of my classes at a less prestigious school, then I know I'm not likely to graduate, and so the alternative options to professional baseball are very low, meaning this number should be quite a bit lower in that situation. If I'm a high school player and I have lots of skills, right? A lot of high school players, for example, will, like we saw, they'll play baseball and play football. So perhaps that number goes up for baseball because I need to be enticed to do that instead of play football. Or perhaps that number is quite a bit lower because this is the only sport I'm good at. Lots of things here, and that selection bias in this case means when we see things happen, there's information that we don't have access to that is driving some of this. And moral hazard means there's information that the decision makers have that other people are not privy to. So the classic case of moral hazard, right, is you get insurance and then you make more risky decisions because you're covered in case of something happens, right? So an uninsured person, let's take health insurance, right? They might go skiing, be less likely to go skiing where they might fall and break their arm. Whereas an insured person knows if I fall and break my arm, I can go to the doctor and get it fixed. I have insurance that's going to cover it. And so a similar thing might be happening here, right? Because the players have information that what their alternative options are, and that will change what draft pick it is that they should be willing to accept.